Have you ever stood in a darkness so thick it felt viscous? Not the mundane dark of a switched-off bedroom, where the street lamp's amber bleed still slips through the window blinds, or where the pale, ghostly smear of a phone screen lingers on the ceiling. No, I am speaking of a primordial, ancient obscurity, the kind of subterranean abyss so profound that even if you pressed your palm directly against your eyeballs, you could not distinguish whether your eyes were open or sewn shut. Down there, the dark is not merely the absence of light. It is an entity. It possesses mass. It crushes against your sternum, slithers into your ear canals, and inhales the very scent of terror seeping from your pores. Along the sprawling ridges of the Appalachians, the old miners, men whose faces are deeply gouged by wrinkles permanently stained with coal dust, pass down an immutable rule of survival. They never commit it to paper, for the most terrifying truths refuse to be confined to ink. They breathe it to one another in raspy, phlegm-rattled whispers. If you find yourself deep in the shafts, or lost in the black woods, and you suddenly hear a voice call out your exact name. No, you didn't hear a damn thing. You absolutely do not answer. You drop your chin, stare at the toes of your boots, and you keep walking. This is no bedtime fable meant to frighten unruly children. It is a survival manual penned in blood, in the marrow of corpses that were never recovered, in the echoes of screams swallowed whole and chewed to gristle by the cavern walls. But such is the nature of men, especially those who fashion themselves the pinnacle of human intellect, that they rarely deign to listen to those smeared in mud. Today I wish to unearth for you a buried dossier from the year 1850, set within the most colossal subterranean labyrinth on earth, Mammoth Cave, Kentucky. It concerns Dr. Arthur, a medical prodigy from New York, who dragged the consummate arrogance of so-called modern science deep into the bowels of the earth, and how that very hubris ultimately fashioned him into a most flawless suit of clothes. You are listening to my tale in the dead of night, aren't you? Perhaps you are nestled beneath warm blankets, earbuds in, swaddled in the familiar silence of your own bedroom. Good, go ahead and luxuriate in that counterfeit safety. But believe me, when this story concludes, you will find yourself casting a paranoid glance at your bedroom door, praying the deadbolt is thrown, and if tonight someone calls your name from the pitch-black hallway beyond, remember the rule of the Appalachians. In 1850, the atmosphere within the Mammoth Cave Tuberculosis Hospital bore no resemblance to any medical ward upon the surface. It carried the musty reek of millennial damp earth, the suffocating chalkiness of limestone, all sickeningly intertwined with the fetid coppery stench of lungs putrefying under the siege of Koch's bacillus. Arthur descended the treacherous, slick steps into the cavern's maw, donning a pristine, perfectly pressed white lab coat, an absolute anomaly against the pitch-black, mucilaginous backdrop of this subterranean hell. In an era where consumption was deemed a bleeding death sentence, humanity clung desperately to any fabricated miracle it could conjure. And Arthur, possessed by the gargantuan ego of a man who viewed himself as a deity in clinical scrubs, truly believed he had unearthed the ultimate truth. He theorized that the frigid, unwavering temperature and the hermetically sealed atmosphere at the bottom of Mammoth Cave served as a flawless incubator. The frost would preserve the decaying, pulmonary tissues. The absolute stillness would cure the violent coughing fits. But he was profoundly mistaken. The silence of the cave was not the tranquility of peace. It was the breathless hush of a steel trap, jaws yawning wide in anticipation. The so-called hospital was in reality nothing more than a pathetic string of canvas, wood, and stone tents haphazardly erected along the flank of a cavernous tunnel. The sole illumination bled from the sickly glow of hurricane lanterns dangling from rotting timber poles, casting the elongated, skeletal shadows of the patients against the jagged cavern walls. It did not resemble a facility of healing. It looked exactly like a catacomb designed for those who were stubbornly still drawing breath. The acoustics down there were sheer psychological torture. The cavern's limestone architecture birthed a monstrous reverberation effect. A single blood-flecked, phlegm-rattling cough from tent number 3 would ricochet, contort, and magnify tenfold against the stone fascias, sounding altogether like the practiced moan of a mangled beast caught in an iron snare. Day after day, night after night, these agonizing noises layered upon one another, orchestrating a sickening symphony of absolute despair. But Arthur was deaf to the despair. As he strode down the claustrophobic aisle between the sickbeds, his leather-bound journal in hand, meticulously logging heart rates and core temperatures, he heard only the immaculate grinding gears of science at work. I have always savored the way physicians like Arthur walk. Are you familiar with that particular posture? The spine held rigidly, the boot heels striking rhythmic cadence against the bedrock, the disdainful gaze piercing right through the dying husks around him, as though they were mere frogs splayed open on a vivisection table. His scent. Ah, the aroma of such concentrated, blinding confidence. It is far more delectable and intoxicating than the rarest of spices. On a twilightless afternoon, for at the bottom of this abyss, time is a thoroughly butchered concept, Arthur was fussing with his gleaming tray of surgical instruments when the old miner Jedediah approached. Jedediah was an Appalachian native, a grizzled wretch contracted to haul provisions and kerosene down from the surface. The man possessed one eye clouded with milky white blindness, while the other remained perpetually wide and feverishly alert, seemingly staring through veils that ought never to be parted. "Doctor," Jedediah rasped, his voice scraping against the eardrums like coarse sandpaper. The old man lingered at the very fringe of the lantern's glow, vehemently refusing to step fully into the light. "You need to pull the perimeter back. Don't let him wander so close to the corpse canvas no more. These past few days, the cave's been gettin' awful restless." Arthur halted his preparations. He slowly lifted his head, pushed the gold-rimmed spectacles up the bridge of his nose, and let a patronizing, asymmetrical smirk crawl across his face. "Restless, Mr. Jedediah. I was entirely unaware that limestone possessed a central nervous system. I was under the impression that megalomania was strictly a symptom of our oxygen-deprived patients. I had no idea it was contagious enough to afflict the deliverymen." Jedi did not laugh. His solitary seeing eye darkened, pinning Arthur with a grave intensity. "You're an educated man, Doctor. Your books might tell you how to stitch up a torn blood vessel, but they sure as hell don't teach you how to survive in a place the sun ain't never touched. Down here the dark is heavy. It's heavy. And it's starvin'. Just last week little Sarah in tent number 7 told me she heard her own mother singin' lullabies echoing up from the bottomless pit." At this, Arthur tapped his fountain pen against the wooden table. He exhaled a long, judgmental sigh, the sort a weary parent reserves for a toddler babbling about the bogeyman. "Auditory hallucinations," Arthur proclaimed with stentorian authority, flipping a page in his journal. "When the human brain is deprived of sensory stimulation for extended periods in low-light environments, it compulsively fills the void with randomized acoustic memories. Sarah is in the advanced stages of pulmonary necrosis. Her spiking fevers induce delirium. I will increase her dosage of laudanum this evening. As for you, Jedediah, I suggest you concentrate on delivering the exact quota of surgical dressings I requested, rather than seeding the minds of my patients with savage indigenous fairy tales." "It ain't no hallucination." The old miner stepped half a pace forward. The lantern light starkly illuminated the cold, beaded sweat breaking across his forehead, in utter defiance of the cavern's bone-chilling cold. "Rule of the rock, Doc, the stone mimics whatever's breathin' down there. It ain't got no shape. It's hollowed out. It learns how folks cry. It learns how folks call each other's names just to bait the hook. If you hear somebody hollerin' your name out from a dead end you ain't never driven a torch into, please plug your ears. Don't you ever answer back. And for the love of God, never grab a lantern and go lookin'." Arthur erupted into laughter. A brittle, bone-dry bark that ricocheted against the cavern walls, momentarily drowning out the tubercular hacking from the surrounding canvas tents. He stepped forward and clapped a firm, condescending hand onto the trembling old miner's shoulder. "Jedediah," Arthur's voice dropped an octave, dripping with a venomous threat sheathed in velvety politeness. "I brought the brilliant light of civilization down into this bat-guano cesspit. I brought science. There are no spirits, there are no demons, and there is no such thing as talking rock. There is only disease, and I am the man who cures it. If you persist in babbling these delusional rumors and disrupting the psychological stability of my patients, I will terminate your contract immediately. Now, get out." Old Jedediah flinched backward. He stared at the hand Arthur had just rested on his shoulder as though it were the rigor mortis claw of a cadaver. Uttering not a single syllable more, the old man pivoted and trudged bleakly into the shadows, melting into the abyssal black ribbon leading back to the surface. That was the final time a sane human being attempted to pull Arthur back from the precipice. From the vantage point of absolute silence, I observed that entire exchange. How utterly radiant Arthur looked in that fleeting moment. He stood there, haloed by the hurricane lantern, throwing light across his immaculate white coat, his chin tipped upwards, his eyes gleaming with the imperious pride of a man who genuinely believed he held dominion over the very laws of the cosmos. Mankind harbors a pathetically dogmatic, blinding faith. They presume that light is a shield. They believe that by hoisting a lantern and banishing a sliver of the gloom, the darkness is somehow annihilated. The grotesque truth is that light never destroys the dark, it merely shoves it back a few meager paces, and worse yet, the light transforms you into a beacon. Standing in the illuminated center of a sprawling, lightless void, you cannot see what lurks in the periphery, but everything in the periphery can see you with razor-sharp clarity. Arthur's science was his luminescence. His ego was the most blinding torch of all. He had deluded himself into playing the Messiah for these tubercular wretches shivering at the bottom of a freezing pit. He was entirely ignorant of the fact that this very savior complex, this rabid, burning desperation to prove the entire world wrong and himself right, was the most exquisite bait imaginable. The pedestrian terror of ordinary humans tastes rancid, bitterly acidic. The cowards who flee are often scrawny, their musculature knotted in unbearable tension, their flesh stringy and uninspired on the palate. But arrogance, the blind, bleeding heart pity of an intellectual? Oh, it excretes a flavor so succulently sweet, so incredibly rich. It compels the prey to willingly strip away all defenses, to voluntarily step outside their circle of safety, and march obediently into the yawning, cavernous maw of oblivion. Arthur scrawled into his leather-bound ledger that very day, "The local populace suffers from profound intellectual inferiority, highly susceptible to hallucinations brought on by vitamin D deficiency. I must intensify my clinical regimen to definitively prove the absoluteness of my methodology." He was correct about one thing. His methodology did, in fact, permanently alter the ecosystem of Mammoth Cave. Only, not in the manner medical science anticipated. Not long after the grizzled old miner departed, the cavern began to deiced. And it always commences with a profoundly unnatural silence, just before the first serpentine whispers slither along the freezing bedrock, calling out the exact names of the souls gasping for their last breath inside the tents. Dr. Arthur, Doctor. The game, at long last, had begun. It began with sounds so gossamer, then so distressingly fragile, that one could easily dismiss them as a fleeting bout of tinnitus. The collapse of an arrogant mind rarely manifests in a deafening explosion. It typically fractures slowly, smoothly, mimicking the infinite patience of groundwater eroding limestone, millimeter by millimeter, across millennia. And the maiden fissure in Dr. Arthur's impenetrable glass house of logic materialized on the morning of the 9th day, when the cot in tent number 4 was found entirely vacant. The first patient to vanish was a carpenter in his late 40s named Thomas. Consumption had mercilessly hollowed out his left lung, transforming every inhalation into a desiccated wheeze that sounded akin to a jagged saw dragging across splintered wood. Yet Thomas had evaporated, without a singular trace. Arthur lowered his hurricane lantern, holding the flame inches from the damp, moss-eaten bedrock surrounding the infirmary tent. The stone surface, polished smooth and treacherous by the cavern's hyper-saturated humidity, harbored not a single distorted footprint. There was no splatter of blood, no chaotic sign of a struggle. The drab gray woolen blanket draped over the cot still bore the deep impression of a body, its residual heat having dissipated hours ago, leaving behind a penetrating, morbid chill. The oil lamp resting on the wooden crate by the bedside remained utterly untouched, its glass chimney frigid, having never been lit. Logic. Arthur forever clung to his holy logic. He smoothed a wrinkle from the lapel of his white coat, cleared his throat, and inscribed into his leather-bound journal with maddeningly meticulous penmanship. Patient Thomas suffered a severe spike in temperature before dawn, resulting in acute delirium. In this fugue state, he vacated the treatment perimeter of his own volition. unequipped with illumination, and has most likely wandered astray into the endless subterranean catacombs. A highly regrettable accident, an indirect side effect of pulmonary necrosis. It was an impeccably reasoned explanation for a cosmopolitan mind. But at a depth of 200 feet beneath the Earth's crust, that explanation was a glaring, farcical joke. How could a wretch who could barely stand without his knees buckling, who hacked up handfuls of necrotic black blood every time he doubled over, silently rise to his feet, plunge into a gelatinous wall of darkness, without colliding against a single razor-sharp stalagmite, and fail to emit a single choking cough that might awaken his neighbors? Furthermore, how could he navigate at all when the human optical system is rendered entirely, pitifully blind in this pitch-black pit? They do not walk away, they are led. The hopelessly desperate are so exquisitely easy to tether. You merely have to whisper the exact melody they are dying to hear. Merely 3 days later, 2 additional patients vanished into the muteness. Panic began to bleed from the fraying seams of the canvas tents, spreading with the virulence of an invisible plague. The surviving invalids curled themselves into tight, fetal knots beneath their threadbare blankets, their sunken, shadowed eyes staring unblinking into the cavernous voids between the stalactite pillars. The atmosphere within the ward became so suffocatingly thick one could have carved it with a scalpel. The loamy ascent of mossy soil was now violently wedded to the faint reek of sulfur and the nauseating, copper-tinged musk of terrified sweat. The ambient temperature of Mammoth Cave holds a constant absolute stability of 54 degrees Fahrenheit year-round. Yet in these recent days, the cold seemed to have grown jagged, invisible teeth. It gnawed sadistically at their joints. It burrowed deep into their spinal marrow. Arthur categorically refused to concede defeat. Imprisoned between the offensively illogical disappearances of his wards and his own towering hubris, he isolated himself. He established a makeshift office at the extreme edge of the sanctuary perimeter, positioned directly against the boundary line, demarcated by a coarse hemp rope slung between 2 jagged crags. On this side of the rope lay the encampment, illuminated by a few dozen sputtering lamps. On the far side yawned a gargantuan, light-devouring maw descending toward a sector known as the bottomless pit, an abyssal drop whose ultimate floor humanity had yet to successfully fathom. And it was exactly upon this fragile threshold that Arthur began learning to listen to the cave breathe. Mammoth Cave is never truly silent. It is a colossal, living organism, continually cycling through fluctuating currents of barometric pressure. The wind snakes through microscopic fissures, slithers over limestone walls calcified over millions of years, and births a groaning, low-frequency ambient hum. Occasionally, it mimics the agonizing shriek of a violently mistuned violin. Other times, it resembles a protracted, mournful whistle. Arthur, his pen scratching furiously against the parchment, attempted to dissect these acoustic frequencies, utilizing the laws of physics. He muttered endlessly to himself regarding resonances effects and auditory pareidolia, the phenomenon whereby a hyper-stressed human brain compulsively constructs familiar patterns from chaotic noise. He was desperately attempting to reduce the darkness to a mathematical equation. But mathematical equations do not cough. At first, it was nothing more than a wet mucosal anomaly echoing up from the absolute nadir of the bottomless pit. A slithering, viscous scrape, horrifyingly evocative of a slab of damp raw meat dragging itself over jagged stones. Arthur froze, his fountain pen hovering precipitously over the ink-smudged parchment. He arrested his breathing, straining to listen. The atmosphere fell as deathly still as a frozen lake, leaving only the frantic percussive thudding inside the doctor's own ribcage. Then, erupting from that pitch-black chasm, a violent rattling cough shattered the quiet, the unmistakable wet hacking of a lung utterly drowned in purulent fluid. Arthur snatched his hurricane lantern and took a single step, pressing his boots flush against the hemp boundary line. The jaundiced light from the faltering wick managed to carve out a mere handful of yards ahead before being savagely devoured by the darkness. "Who is there?" Arthur called out, his voice instantly pulverized by the rock faces, returning to him as a grotesquely distorted mockery. "Who is. A gelatinous, impenetrable silence was his only reply. The wind ceased entirely. The flame encased in its glass chimney refused to even quiver. Then a voice materialized. It was no cavernous echo. It was no trick of the wind slipping through a fissure. It was piercingly sharp, horribly distinct, and spatially anchored at a precise coordinate roughly 15 yards below Arthur's footing, hovering in the pitch-black void above the drop. Dr. Arthur. A violent shudder racked his frame. The fine hairs on the nape of his neck bristled, and each individual vertebra turned instantly to ice, as if drenched in glacial water. That timbre. It was undeniably the voice of William, an elderly patient who had vanished just the night prior. But something was sickeningly wrong with the inflection. It was too agonizingly flat. It lacked the organic micro-vibrations of a human larynx. It recited his name with the mechanical lifelessness of a phonograph needle trapped in a scratched groove, repeating the phrase at the exact same pitch with the exact same simulated breath. Arthur, help! It is so dark down here. A rational man, a creature possessed by rudimentary, primal instincts of self-preservation, upon confronting such a profoundly unnatural sound blooming from a lifeless abyss, would have immediately pivoted and bolted. They would have run headlong toward the safety of the lights, abandoning that accursed perimeter forever. But the devil, or whatever ancient abominations you humans choose to crown with such poetic titles, never truly needs to lunge out with bared fangs to secure its prey. Particularly not when hunting prey severely afflicted by a savior complex. I had absolutely no need to chase him. All I had to do was dangle a morsel, marinated in mystery, sprinkled with a dash of pitiable agony, just enough to arouse the grandiose ego of the intellectual. Arthur did not flee. Instead, he furrowed his brow, pushing his gold-rimmed glasses up his nose once more. His jaw clamped shut in rigid tension, yet behind those lenses his eyes ignited with the blinding brilliance of fatal curiosity. He reached out, wrapping his fingers around the hemp rope that partitioned the realm of the living from the void. The abrasive bite of the fibers against his skin offered a grounding, tactile sensation, attempting to tether him to logic. "William, is that you?" Arthur called down into the chasm, lowering the lantern in a futile bid to illuminate the infinite. "How on earth did you manage to get down there? Are you trapped on a ledge? Remain silent, conserve your energy. The hypoxia is already compromising your vocal cords." Hearing those absurd rationalizations hidden layers of darkness where light is forever denied entry. Had I worn a face in that moment, I surely would have smiled so wide it ripped at the hinges of my jaw. The vanity of intellect is truly the most exquisite of snares. Arthur preferred to believe that a dying tubercular old man had free climbed down a sheer vertical rock face in absolute blindness, preferred to diagnose a ruined larynx as mere hypoxia, rather than confront the apocalyptic realization that deep within the bowels of the earth there are governing laws which the pitiful annals of mankind are entirely unqualified to chronicle. "Doctor, it hurts so much, Arthur." The cry drifted upward once more, this time laced with a harrowing, mournful whimper. It mercilessly scraped against the greatest psychological vulnerability of our dear physician: impotence. Arthur simply could not stomach the gist of a medical conundrum lying just out of reach, could not abide a patient shrieking his name while he stood paralyzed, incapable of surgical intervention. He stumbled a step backward, swallowing hard against a throat that had gone utterly arid. The pungent sting of oxidized iron assaulted his nasal cavities. The environment seemed to physically constrict around him. The colossal stalactites dripping from the ceiling appeared as rows of jagged fangs, slowly, methodically clamping shut. The light from the lantern in his fist began to stutter violently, the flame thrashing about like a drowning creature desperately tearing at the last pockets of oxygen. "I will return with ropes and additional lighting. Stay exactly where you are," Arthur bellowed, his tone straining to suppress its tremors, though the trailing syllables hopelessly shattered. He yanked his lantern away, pivoting sharply on his heel, his leather shoes slamming a panicked tattoo against the stone as he marched swiftly back toward the encampment. He turned his back on the darkness, a tragically classical error. Up from the lightless dregs of the bottomless pit, that gelatinous, scraping anomaly began to mobilize. It did not merely crawl along the vertical face. It slithered upward, adhering to the craggy inclines with grotesque, preternatural speed, completely devoid of the auditory clatter of bone or muscle. It surged upward, dragging behind it a freezing miasmic wake, choked with the odor of freshly turned graves and rotting meat. Just as Arthur disappeared around the curvature of the tunnel, abandoning the rope barrier to the shadows, the cry of Arthur pierced the air a final time. But this time, it did not echo from the abyssal depths. It resonated from the very edge of the boundary, from the precise spot his lantern had illuminated mere seconds prior. It learns remarkably fast, and it was starving, possessed by a ravenous, millennial hunger that could only be pacified by the succulent flesh of the intellectually vain, those tragic fools who harbor the delusion that a flickering wick is enough to conquer the primordial night. The inaugural fracture was entirely complete. The heavy iron door guarding Arthur's sanity had been officially pried off its hinges. He was no longer a physician rounding on his wards. He had been demoted to a beast of prey, blindly basting himself in savory spices, sleepwalking slowly toward the feasting table in blissful ignorance, while the dark waited with infinite patience, jaws unhinged, anticipating the exquisite moment he would cross the rope of his own volition. And that moment was drawing suffocatingly near. The frantic, percussive thudding of leather soles retreated into the distance, abandoning the rope perimeter to the deafening silence. Yet the entity lurking beneath the suffocating fog of the bottomless pit knew with absolute certainty that he would return. The prey had bitten the hook. He simply hadn't swallowed the barb quite yet. Arthur hurtled into his makeshift workspace like a sleepwalker violently jolted awake. His chest heaved erratically, every exhalation manifesting as a plume of milky vapor that hastily dissolved into the freezing ether. His hands, which had always maintained an absolute glacial stillness, while gripping a scalpel, now fumbled clumsily, knocking over a vial of rubbing alcohol. The resultant ear-splitting shatter of glass caused him to violently flinch. He snatched up a thick coil of coarse hemp rope, cold sweat weeping profusely from his pallid palms. The logic center of his brain was screaming, hammering frantically against the doors of his perception. Why was William down there? How could an emaciated geriatric with pulverized lungs successfully scale down a sheer, slime-coated precipice devoid of a single guiding beam of light? But his megalomania, that invisible monstrosity reigning supreme over his genius mind, instantly stretched its limbs, ruthlessly crushing every speck of doubt. There must be a gently sloping subterranean bypass that those provincial miners intentionally concealed. They undoubtedly manipulated the patients into wandering off, a petty conspiracy to prove the elite physician wrong. I am the sole arbiter of their mortality. I cannot, and will never, permit a patient to expire beyond the strict parameters of my medical jurisdiction. And, in that precise damning moment, as the toxic seed of conceit sank its roots agonizingly deep into Arthur's psyche, the subterranean darkness altered its strategy. It recognized that the flat, soulless drone of old William was not honed enough to completely sever this man's final thread of defense. It required a far more exquisite blade. A surgical injection plunged directly into the festering tumor known as blind compassion. Just as Arthur hoisted a second hurricane lantern, striking a match to a flame up within the cracked glass chimney, a new auditory anomaly manifested. It no longer drifted aimlessly upward from the cavernous depths. This sound slithered flush against the damp bedrock, weaving beneath the frames of abandoned cots, snaking around stalagmite columns millions of years in the making, until it burrowed directly into his ear canal. A weep. It was not the blood-curdling shriek of a victim being torn asunder by wild beasts. A scream is too cacophonous. It breeds the immediate reflex of flight. This sobbing was infinitely more delicate, and immeasurably more sadistic. It was the fractured, choking whimper of a child whose oxygen was being systematically robbed by agony. A gossamer wail inextricably laced with rattling, wet coughs, suffocating under the thick mucus stagnating within putrefying lungs. "Doctor, Uncle Arthur, I am so cold." Arthur's jaw locked with the violence of a rusted bear trap. The coil of rope slipped from his grasp, slamming onto the bedrock and erupting in a cloud of filthy particulate. The hair across the entirety of his body stood erect in unified horror. Sarah, that precise timbre, that exact staccato rhythm, it was undeniably little Sarah. His youngest, most compliant ward, the one who had evaporated from her sickbed 3.5 days prior. The little girl whose sweat-matted hair he had once stroked, promising that the absolute stillness of this subterranean vault would return to her a healthy pair of lungs. She was his unfinished masterpiece, the living vindication he intended to slap across the faces of the archaic physicians back in New York. The sound was terrifyingly authentic, carrying even the horrific chattering of teeth violently colliding in the 54-degree freeze, carrying the desperate hiccups of a fragile soul hovering on the precipice of salvation. The initial wave of paralyzing dread within Arthur was instantly eclipsed, entirely vaporized by a vastly more toxic, thousands of times more potent emotion, the rabid fury of a Messiah whose lamb had been violently stolen. He snatched up his leather medical satchel, haphazardly stuffing it with rolls of gauze, alcohol-soaked cotton, and a high-potency vial of laudanum. He completely neglected to don a heavy winter coat or gather any survival rations. The flimsy white lab coat, his paramount symbol of clinical supremacy, billowed and snapped in the cavern's freakish drafts as he took massive, frantic strides. He plunged madly back toward the red line perimeter, toward the space where the darkness sat in absolute silence, its jaws unhinged in patient anticipation. The coarse hemp rope materialized within the sickly, jaundiced halo of his lantern. The gruff, raspy warning of old Jedediah cascaded through his memory, and for the love of God, never grab a lantern and go lookin'. Arthur skidded to a halt. The toe of his leather boot hovered a mere half-span from the boundary rope. The flame imprisoned in the glass chimney projected his contorted shadow against the colossal limestone wall behind him, making him appear exactly like a spindly, pathetic insect, hesitating on the lethal rim of an antlion's pit. The void was so deafeningly silent that he could hear the frantic percussion of his own heart hammering against his eardrums, syncing rhythmically with the hollow dripping of subterranean water echoing from some impossibly distant alcove. And then Sarah's weeping arose once more, this time agonizingly wretched and torn, sounding as though someone were methodically snapping her knuckles one by one. "Uncle, down here. There is someone. It is wearing clothes. I am coming, Sarah. I am right here. Do not panic." Arthur roared, his ironclad tone attempting to crush the involuntary tremors seizing his vocal cords, and he lifted his boot, stepping decisively over the hemp rope. The suicidal blade had been officially unsheathed. The very microsecond, his leather sole made contact with the mucosal bedrock on the forbidden side of the threshold, the entire ecosystem of the cavern seemingly mutated in the blink of an eye. The atmosphere ceased its natural circulatory drafts. It coagulated, turning horrifyingly viscous, plastering itself against his flesh like a coat of freezing, wet sludge. The faint, characteristic sulfuric odor of limestone abruptly violently intensified, fusing with a putrid, coppery stench of dew-soaked rust, the ichable, nauseating aroma of arterial blood evaporating at an agonizingly slow pace within an unventilated vault. His light was immediately suffocated. If, back at the encampment, the hurricane lantern could push the gloom back a generous 15 feet here, drowning in the territory of the bottomless pit, that sickly yellow luminescence was ruthlessly cannibalized by the hypercondensed night, compressed into a pitifully meager halo scarcely illuminating Arthur's boots. The darkness down here was no mere vacuum. It possessed tentacles. It rubbed hungrily against the fragile edges of the light, coiled and salivating, waiting to pounce and devour him the instant that flame perished. He was voluntarily descending down the esophagus of a gargantuan, living abomination. The route down into the bottomless pit was no man-made staircase. It was a gradual incline, yet violently choked with jagged boulders, sharp as a wolf's fangs, rendered treacherously slick by a layer of festering moss and a mucilaginous groundwater that felt akin to the saliva of Mother Earth. Every single step Arthur took was a mortal wager. The soles of his leather boots skidded relentlessly, forcing him to cast aside the dignified poise of a physician and dig his bare fingers into the freezing bedrock to maintain his equilibrium. The abrasive stone tore the flesh from his fingertips. Fresh blood seeped out, mingling with the slimy moss. He paid no heed to the stinging agony. A volatile cocktail of adrenaline and supreme arrogance had anesthetized every pain receptor, mutating him into a mindless automaton driven only to push forward. Within that eternity of gloom, little Sarah's weeping transmuted into an invisible noose, hurled from the realm of the dead, snagging tightly around his throat and methodically dragging him deeper into the abyss. The unseen stalker was an absolute maestro of psychological pacing. Whenever Arthur's momentum faltered from sheer exhaustion, whenever the bone-chilling frost began to shriek through his knee joints, the weeping would suddenly escalate into an agonizing zenith of despair, interwoven with the harrowing, scraping sound of fingernails clawing desperately against the stone. "It hurts so much, Doctor. It hurts." And Arthur would violently grind his teeth, cerulean veins bulging across his forehead, blindly plunging into claustrophobic subterranean arteries he had never once charted. Yet, whenever he frantically accelerated, risking a catastrophic, headlong plunge into some cavernous fissure, the crying would recede with a bizarre gentleness. It wafted, whimpering like a soft, soothing lullaby, materializing directly before his face, close enough to convince him that if he only reached beyond the frail halo of his lantern, his fingers might brush against the freezing hem of his patient's gown. The manipulation was so flawlessly orchestrated that Arthur remained utterly oblivious to the fact he was being herded along an erratic, zigzagging trajectory, severing him completely from any primary artery that could offer salvation. The deeper he descended, the more oppressively the space constricted. The colossal stalactites that once soared high across the cavern ceiling now swooped agonizingly low, tapering to razor-sharp points, interlocking like the slowly snapping incisors of a leviathan shark. The temperature plummeted precipitously. Arthur's exhalations were no longer mere ephemeral mists. They congealed, crystallizing into microscopic frost that settled in a stark white rime across his gold-rimmed spectacles, ruthlessly robbing him of his pitifully scarce visibility. He frantically dragged the bleeding back of his hand across the lenses, leaving behind a smeared, bruised red streak on the glass which bathed the entirety of the world around him in a grotesque, rust-pink macabre. The suffocating atmosphere began to strangle his lungs. A paralytic wave of claustrophobia crashed over him. The mass of millions of tons of limestone above seemed to hover mere inches from his scalp, violently compressing the air, crushing every panicked flutter of his heart. The darkness lingering at the fringe of his stuttering light began to churn and spiral, molding itself into grotesque deformities hallucinated by a brain starved of oxygen. The concavities of the rock faces warped into the visages of flayed men, their jaws unhinged in silent, agonizing screams. The elongated, weeping stalactites, glistening under the flickering light, looked indistinguishable from gargantuan, bleeding umbilical cords dangling from the ceiling of hell. Arthur staggered to a halt. His knees quaked uncontrollably, knocking together with an audible rattle. The hollow of his chest emitted a pathetic, wheezing rasp, sounding identically like the tubercular wretches he had so perpetually disdained. Frigid sweat erupted from his pores, cascading in rivulets down his spine, entirely saturating the thin dress shirt beneath his mud-splattered white lab coat. Hoisted the hurricane lantern as high as his trembling arm would permit. The flame popped and sputtered weakly, the wick shriveling upon itself as though it too were having its final dregs of vitality siphoned away by the dark. "Sarah!" Arthur rasped, forcing air through a desert-dry larynx. The authoritative, condescending baritone of the chief physician had been entirely flayed away, discarded somewhere along that treacherous slope. The words that tumbled out were now merely the fragile, fractured whimpers of a prey profoundly exhausted and disoriented. The response was absolute silence, not the mundane, tranquil silence of night. This was a gelatinous muteness, bearing a colossal barometric pressure that clamped so violently against his eardrums, Arthur felt as though fresh blood were about to rupture from his eye sockets. Sarah's weeping had abruptly ceased, entirely vanished. No more sobbing, no more tubercular hacking, not a single plea for salvation. It had been severed with sudden, ruthless precision, exactly like a steel trap snapping shut the instant the rat stood perfectly centered upon the spikes. There remained only a solitary sound adrift in that suffocating expanse, the hollow, distant dripping of water, and a visceral slithering. It was that same mucosal, muddy scraping from before. But there was one excruciating detail that caused the survival neurons in Arthur's brain to detonate in a screaming frenzy. The sound was no longer echoing up from the unfathomable depths of the chasm. No, the acoustic architecture of the cavern had deceived his logical mind in a spectacular, lethal coup, that abrasive slithering of a wet, fleshy mass dragging against the limestone. It was emanating from a coordinate higher than the crown of his head, directly upon the pitch-black, impenetrable ceiling where his meager lantern light could never hope to lick, and it was methodically, smoothly inching its way down the rock face, rhythmic, utterly soundless, directly behind him, separated from the cold, sweat-stippled nape of his neck by nothing more than a dying breath. In a fraction of a second, the entire conceptual framework of space and orientation within Arthur's brain shattered into pathetic, jagged shards. He dared not turn his head, absolutely not. The most primordial survival instinct of mankind, that feral impulse suppressed for decades by medical tomes and the sheer hubris of the intellectual elite, now flared into an inferno, screaming and clawing at the interior of his ribcage, commanding his musculature to contract, commanding him to run. But he could not. His feet felt cast in molten lead, violently bolted to the mucilaginous stone. A bead of freezing water plummeted from the ceiling directly onto Arthur's nape, sliding a long icy trail down his spine, bearing the exact agonizing chill of a scalpel slicing through living tissue. Or was it water at all? The exhalation ghosting across his neck did not carry the dampness of limestone. It was viscous, nauseating. It was the stench of soil exhumed from a centuries-old grave, the reek of necrotic bone marrow, and most potently, the overpowering odor of rusted brass. The scent of coagulated blood left exposed to the elements until it had turned a sickening, pitch black. The ambient temperature plummeted into a free fall. The frost sank its invisible, serrated teeth deep into his violently quaking kneecaps. Arthur stumbled and lunged forward with the blind reflex of a cornered beast, his leather shoes hydroplaning across the slurry of mud. He flailed, swinging his arm in a desperate bid to find an anchor. But the frantically swinging lantern illuminated the most merciless truth of all. The sickly yellow light washed over an undulating solid surface barring his line of sight. A monolithic wall of limestone, towering, impeccably smooth and weeping with moss. A dead end. He slammed headlong into the rock face, shattering into a choked, suffocating sob. His 10 lacerated fingertips clawed maniacally at the freezing stone, leaving ghastly streaks of fresh blood illuminated by the dying embers of his light, desperately attempting to excavate an illusory salvation. There were no subterranean arteries. There was no void in which to cower. The entirety of that gentle slope he had descended, the labyrinthine switchbacks and serpentine corners, all of it had been a meticulously engineered funnel designed to herd the arrogant woodsman into the very bottom of the cage. Little Sarah's sorrowful weeping had evaporated entirely, leaving not a ghost of an echo. The claustrophobic, domed expanse was now flooded by a different auditory horror, one infinitely more paralyzing than every agonizing shriek in the mortal world combined. It dropped from the cavern ceiling onto the bedrock directly behind Arthur. It was not the concussive crash of a heavy solid object in freefall, but a gelatinous, sodden thud, sickeningly identical to the sound of a mangled, waterlogged slab of meat being hurled into a pool of sludge. And then, the cacophony of bone and cartilage commenced. Arthur stood plastered against the dead-end wall, eyes screwed tightly shut, scalding tears cascading to intermingle with the brine of his sweat, compelling himself to endure the auditory nightmare of the entity shifting behind him. It possessed no human skeletal architecture, or, if it did it was deliberately snapping and contorting every singular joint to force itself into an upright posture. Crack, snap. The sounds echoed like the thick, desiccated branches of ancient timber being violently splintered in half, interspersed with the repulsive, wet tearing of mucosal muscle fibers being stretched until they violently ruptured, hips dislocating violently from their sockets, a spine buckling and undulating with erratic spasms, bulging cerulean tendons, pulling taut and snapping like coarse hemp ropes disintegrating beneath the weight of 1,000 tons. Dr. Arthur's genius intellect rallied for one final desperate bid at self-preservation. It attempted to analyze a hibernating cavern bear, a stray cougar, or perhaps a partial cave-in inducing auditory hallucinations. But no, every logical equation spontaneously combusted into ash. He knew this was a biological entity, yet its anatomical configuration was blaspheming every solitary law of nature that humanity had ever so arrogantly chronicled. The agonizing symphony of contorting bones ceased. A prolonged wet and rattling exhalation spewed into the breathless silence, violently kicking up a swirling tempest of rock dust within his faltering halo of light. It had stood up, and it was tall, aberrantly, impossibly tall. Its silhouette burned against the rock face directly before Arthur, completely swallowing his own shadow, devouring the lantern's glow with a suffocating tyranny. That shadow was a gangling monstrosity, grazing the oppressive, low-hanging ceiling, possessing grotesquely elongated, multi-jointed appendages that hinged like the legs of a colossal arachnid. Arthur knew he could not hide his face forever. A fatal, morbid curiosity, or perhaps absolute submission to his terror, forced him to turn around. Every cervical vertebra ground together with a sickening crunch as he slowly, agonizingly slowly pivoted, his hand clutching the handle of the violently trembling hurricane lantern. The feeble flame within the glass chimney danced a maniacal, erratic waltz, surging and plummeting, thrashing about as if it were drowning in an atmosphere coagulated by the stench of death. The light swept across the mucosal floor, grazed over a pair of skeletal, bleeding, barefoot extremities rooting themselves into the rock, and began its terrifying crawl upward. And there, barricading the sole exit, eclipsing the entirety of his peripheral vision, stood the very progenitor of all primordial nightmares. The entity stood with its back to him. Its mass and proportions were utterly nonsensical for any terrestrial biological organism. It had to be over 7 feet tall. Its spine bowed severely to evade the stalactite daggers plunging from the ceiling. Its 2 arms hung limp, unnaturally long, stretching well past its knees, swaying with gaunt, needle-sharp fingers that resembled brittle kindling encased in a membrane of murky, translucent slime. But the revelation that caused Arthur's pupils to violently contract, the sight that arrested his heartbeat so abruptly, his sternum throbbed as if struck by a sledgehammer, was not its grotesque morphology. It was what it was wearing. This was no feral beast clad in a rugged hide of scales or abhorrent fur. It was draped in textiles reeking of human civilization. A stark white laboratory coat. The garment was soiled with mud, smeared with streaks of blood that had oxidized into a profound tarry black. Yet the immaculate crease of the lapels and the row of mother-of-pearl buttons, gleaming in the firelight, were chillingly familiar. This was no scavenged rag pulled from a refuse heap. It was a bespoke, tailored garment. The elongated tails of the coat hung dismally, expanding and deflating with a sickening irregularity, looking exactly as though one had draped an opulent suit over a hastily contorted iron armature rather than a body of substantial flesh and bone. Arthur blinked in rapid succession, desperately trying to banish the lunatic mirage corroding his retinas. That coat, the microscopic tear on the left breast pocket, the jaundice stain from an accidental spill of potassium permanganate last week. It was his own lab coat, the exact mantle he wore with such towering pride during his ward rounds, the ultimate symbol of clinical authority, of the savior christened Dr. Arthur. But he plunged his gaze downward to stare at his own chest. He was wearing it. His coat was plastered flush against his own trembling flesh. In this very second, the sheer absurdity of space-time began to cannibalize his sanity. What was happening? Who was the true self? At that exact moment, the entity began to move. It did not pivot its entire torso. Its lower body and those gangling legs remained bolted in place, keeping its back presented to him. Instead, its neck began to wrench violently backward. Crack! Rip! The horrifying percussion of shattering cartilage rang with crystalline clarity in the claustrophobic space. Its cervical vertebrae willingly snapped, rotating a merciless and absolute 180 degrees, dragging the entire upper torso into a violent torsion, wringing it out like a soaked rag. The lab coat wrinkled violently, its seams pulling so taut they threatened to tear. The visage of the entity slowly emerged from the abyss, drifting into the stuttering glow of the hurricane lantern. Arthur's jaw fell slack, yet not a singular sound could escape a throat paralyzed by absolute terror. He was not staring into the fanged muzzle of a demon. He was not looking upon a faceless abyssal monstrosity. His heart felt as though it had been hurled into a glacial vault, shattering into 1,000 razor-sharp shards that drove backward into his own veins. It wore the face of a man. Furthermore, it wore his own face, a pallid, chalk-white sheet of face skin, entirely devoid of capillary circulation, was draped loosely over the misshapen architecture of the skull beneath. This was no feat of sorcerous illusion. It was a naked, bloody, mucosal reality, A pristine, intact organs, cartilage, and bone, only to be haphazardly stuffed with some grotesque amalgamation of subterranean soil and fungal rot, forging a flawless exterior sheath. The familiar gold-rimmed spectacles, the very glasses Arthur had believed were resting securely upon his own nose, were now precariously perched upon the flattened, cartilageless nasal bridge of the abomination. But the atrocity that truly breached the threshold of human endurance, the horror that utterly bulldozed the barricades of insanity, was the entity's smile. It was smiling. A confident, warm, pacifying, and overwhelmingly patronizing smile, the trademark smirk of Dr. Arthur whenever he waltzed into the infirmary ward. Except, to achieve the sweeping arc of that smile upon a face entirely stripped of its elastic musculature, whatever lurked inside that dermal sheath had been forced to exert violent leverage. The commissures of the lips were stretched to their absolute physical limits, the upper and lower tissues snapping their final, fragile sinews, ripping violently open all the way to the earlobes. From those jagged, butchered fissures, a viscous black ichor oozed, dripping relentlessly onto the pristine starched collar of the lab coat. It beamed a gaping, lacerated grin, bearing not human teeth but a bottomless, pitch-black void, writhing with the pulsating contractions of a gargantuan gullet absolutely starved for life. The orbital sockets behind the lenses contained no eyeballs. They were merely two hollow, abyssal as dry wells, yet Arthur could palpably feel a sadistic, mocking cruelty spiraling directly from those twin black holes, boring deep into the marrow of his soul. "Doctor," the entity spoke. This time it was not the counterfeit weeping of little Sarah, nor the pitiful moans of old William. It was his own baritone, rich, commanding, steeped in confidence and towering pride. The acoustics escaping that butchered maw echoed against the stone walls, a mimicry so paralyzingly perfect it made the original's skin crawl. It was learning. It was applying the final, masterful brushstrokes to its flawless portrait. The sensation of total collapse crashed down like a landslide, pulverizing Arthur's physical form. His knees were bled of all vitality, slamming violently into the jagged stone, tearing through his trousers and plunging into his flesh, yet he registered no agony. The world around him spun in a nauseating vertigo. He raised his trembling, lacerated hands before his eyes. The skin upon his own fingers appeared to be turning translucent, loose, fading into a ghostly irrelevance. If the thing standing before him was Dr. Arthur, then who was he? What was he? His transcendent intellect, the grueling years of medical academia in New York, the titanic ego of a messiah wielding the lantern of science to illuminate the dark. All of it withered into a farcical, rotting absurdity. Science had never shielded him. Logic had never been a weapon. They were merely the most exquisite of marinades, the softest of silk carpets rolled out to welcome this very culmination. He had been so fatally arrogant, believing he had descended into the earth to conquer it. No, he had been summoned down here to make a delivery. And the cargo was his own life, his own flesh, his own visage. The entity slowly lowered its snapped, inverted neck. The mouth, torn wide to the ears, hung ajar, exhaling a glacial gust pregnant with the stench of 1,000 corpses rotting across geological epochs. It was in no rush. It did not roar. It simply stood there, savoring the absolute, terminal despair, congealing within its prey's eyes, rolling the exquisite flavor of a mind fracturing piece by piece across its unseen tongue. Arthur's fingers went utterly limp. The hurricane lantern slipped from his grasp, plummeting in freefall to the bedrock. The razor-sharp shatter of breaking glass violently lacerated the suffocating silence. The flame danced one final, violent leap, flaring with furious brilliance for a fraction of a second, permanently searing that colossal black silhouette and its butchered smile into the retinas of the arrogant physician. Then the light perished, utterly and absolutely extinguished. The darkness crashed down like a tidal wave forged of liquid pitch, devouring all. Within that sightless, bottomless pit, nothing remained in existence save for the wet, smacking sounds of a barbaric feast and the abrasive, ripping tear of a brand-new suit of clothes being flayed from a body that was still violently convulsing. Arthur ceased to exist. Now there remained only Dr. Arthur, finalizing his preparations to ascend to the surface. The darkness crashed down like a tidal wave forged of liquid pitch, devouring all. Within that sightless, bottomless pit, Nothing remained in existence save for the wet, smacking sounds of a barbaric feast and the abrasive, ripping tear of a brand-new suit of clothes being flayed from a body that was still violently convulsing. Arthur ceased to exist. Now there remained only Dr. Arthur, finalizing his preparations to ascend to the surface. I paused for a moment to readjust the larynx. You see, the human vocal cord is an exquisitely delicate architecture of muscle and cartilage, yet it is so terribly fragile. In order to emulate that rich, authoritative, and profoundly arrogant baritone of the late doctor, I had to meticulously braid the bleeding, mangled bronchial tubes together, stretching them taut across a rib cage I had just battered into splinters. Guck, rip, I cleared my throat. A sharp pang lanced through the trachea, carrying the brackish brine of fresh blood and the odor of oxidized iron. Auditory hallucination. I tested a phrase he was so fond of wielding. Initially, the acoustics emerged shrill, distorted, and warbling, akin to the screech of a roosting bat swarm. I plunged my two elongated, pallid thumbs deep into the throat of my new skin, manually realigning the arrhythmic cartilaginous rings. A little more tension. A touch more mucus secreted from the palate. I tried again. Auditory hallucinations. A highly regrettable accident, an indirect side effect of pulmonary necrosis. Flawless this time. The timbre resonant, the cadence dripping with decisive arrogance. The fit was slightly loose around the jawline, but no matter, I could leverage the masseter muscles to clamp it tight. I caressed the crease of the white lab coat's lapel, flicking away the droplets of black blood clinging to the mother-of-pearl buttons. You know, acting as your historical narrator up at those points, I have maintained a guise of absolute neutrality. But now, with the mask violently torn away, I must confess something to you. I have always savored physicians like Arthur. They possess a highly exquisite flavor. The terror of the cowardly wretches upon the surface typically carries the rancid, bitter tang of blind panic. But Arthur? His flesh was steeped in absolute conviction, marinated in the titanic ego of a man who believed the entire cosmos could be neatly folded into a handful of pulp paper medical journals. When my talons breached his sternum, methodically excavating the steaming, still pulsating clusters of his viscera to leave behind a perfectly hollowed husk of skin. Oh, the look in his eyes was breathtaking. Those pupils, dilated to their absolute limits behind the gold-rimmed glass, held more than just the primal panic of death. They overflowed with an absolute, shattering unacceptability, the total collapse of an ideology. It was the most delectable appetizer this cavern had served me in several ice ages. I slipped into his skin. The sensation of sliding into a fresh suit of human meat is always mildly unpleasant in the opening minutes. It is cold, sodden, and clings flush against my abyssal form like a hermetic seal. I had to snap my own kneecaps, compress my spine until it bowed, and shrink my gargantuan morphology to wedge myself seamlessly into his height of under 6 feet. It was a rather tight fit. The dermis wrinkled and sagged around the abdomen, but I had this magnificent white lab coat to camouflage the bloody, gelatinous gore that had yet to scar over. I retrieved the gold-rimmed spectacles discarded on the bedrock, gingerly hooking them over a flaccid, cartilageless nasal bridge. The darkness at the bottom of the pit was no longer an obstacle. It was my second pair of eyes. I pivoted leisurely, gliding with velvet footsteps across the slick stone, ascending toward the surface, abandoning the festering heap of Arthur's original entrails to rot in the abyss. When I returned to the infirmary encampment, where the sputtering hurricane lanterns were still valiantly battling the 54-degree freeze, everything remained in its miserable status quo. The wretched invalids were curled into fetal knots beneath their threadbare blankets, shivering and violently hacking up wads of black blood. The odor of sulfur commingling with necrotic pulmonary tissue birthed a wafting, highly agreeable bouquet, akin to the aroma of a smokehouse curing meats at the absolute peak of fermentation. A handful of patients lifted their sunken, bruised eyes at the cadence of my approaching footsteps. They registered no discrepancy. The abysmal lighting of the cavern had thoroughly deceived their optics. In their eyes, I was still that rigidly upright silhouette, still draped in the immaculate white coat, still the sovereign Messiah bearing the weight of their mortality upon my shoulders. "Doctor," Arthur, an old woman rasped, extending a skeletal hand bulging with cerulean veins past the edge of her cot to weakly paw at my hem. "Did you find little Sarah?" She was weeping. I halted. I rotated my head slowly to peer down at the hag. The spine encased within the skin emitted a wonderfully subdued crackle. I exerted a monumental effort to constrict my smile, ensuring it did not rip open to my ears as it had in the depths, despite my musculature screaming for a stretch. I curled the corners of my lips into a distorted arc, commanding the rich baritone to resonate in absolute perfection. "There is no one weeping, madam. You need to rest. Go to sleep. Winter this year is going to be incredibly long." I brushed her hand aside, not with barbaric force, but bearing the unyielding chill of a catacomb, and resumed my brisk stride. I marched past dozens of tents, sweeping past dozens of eyes tracking me with pitiful, begging reverence. They simply assumed I was fed vacation, or perhaps marching out to the mine shafts to demand more charcoal and bandages from old Jedediah. They lay there in total obedience, clinging to the cheap, pathetic currency of human hope, waiting for their medical deity to return. But I did not return. I walked straight toward the gentle incline leading to the surface of the earth. With every passing stride, the mucosal, humid draughts of the cavern were usurped by the arid, earthy musk of decaying flora from the outside world. A pallid, jaundiced moonlight bled through the ancient canopy of pines, casting a ghostly aura into the colossal maw of the cave. And there, barricading the singular threshold leading back to the surface, stood a gargantuan iron gate, forged by the very arrogant hands of mankind. The gate boasted iron bars as thick as a toddler's wrist, pitch black with rust and evening dew. It was designed to deter bears, feral boars, or overly curious wanderers from stumbling into the ward. But mankind forever engineers things for the wrong purpose. I reached out, caressing the freezing metallic surface. The flesh of my fingers glided delicately across the iron, leaving behind a faint, translucent smear of blood. I stepped outside with chilling poise, welcoming the midnight squall that violently whipped the tails of my lab coat. Then, with a singular fluid motion, I hauled the gargantuan iron gate shut. Clang! The concussive, deafening shriek of metal colliding with metal tore through the Appalachian night, ricocheting backward into the bowels of the cavern like a tolling death knell. I retrieved the massive brass padlock, as large as two clasped hands, threaded it through the heavy iron chain, and violently twisted the key. Click! The deadbolt slammed home, rigid, hopeless, utterly irrevocable. From deep within the subterranean abyss, a torrential acoustic wave erupted, akin to a dam violently bursting. It was not water, it was screaming. Dozens of tubercular patients, creatures who mere minutes prior had been too frail to utter a single syllable, now realized their final gateway to life had been padlocked from the outside. The true darkness was only just beginning to bleed from the fissures, slowly slithering out to lick at their heels. Their shrieks battered against the rock face, shattering, contorting, mutating into the collective, slaughterhouse squeal of livestock waiting for the butcher's blade. I stood just outside the cavern's maw, inhaling a deep, euphoric lungful of the pristine terrestrial air, smiling as I drank in that symphony, a flawless subterranean larder for the winter. Temperature stable, zero risk of putrefaction, and whenever the hunger strikes, I need only wear the flesh of our esteemed physician, stroll leisurely down the incline and wring their necks one by one. They will not flee, they will even throw their arms wide to embrace me, for they still believe I have come to administer their cure. Humans so habitually search for monsters cowering beneath their beds, swaddling themselves in thick quilts, clinging to the delusion that a flimsy wooden door can barricade against the demonic. You devour countless pages of historical text, hallucinating your own invincibility through the illuminating light of science and logic, devoutly believing that mankind has truly domesticated the cosmos. But you see, this world is not terrifying because the dark possesses fangs. It is terrifying because the sheer hubris of humanity, that wretched hero complex forever boiling within your veins, is the most intoxicating bait in existence. To entities that have reigned beneath the earth since before the ape ever struck flint for fire. Your benevolence, your intelligence, your blind, bleeding heart pity are nothing more than a dinner bell. We never need to expend the agonizing effort of a hunt. We need only crack a door open into the dark, whisper a spur of agony, and you will baste yourselves in spices and march willingly right into our waiting maws. Now, be entirely honest with me. I know you are lying there, I know you have your earphones pressed tight, the blanket pulled over your head, allowing the sickly blue pallor of your phone screen to cast its glow upon a face now paralyzed by dread. The atmosphere in your room feels just a fraction colder now, doesn't it? If tonight, as the darkness in your hallway coagulates. If from the suffocating silence of your living room, you suddenly hear the voice of the person you hold dearest, the voice of your mother, your sibling, or your precious, fragile child, weeping softly and calling your exact name, help. It's so dark. Will you remember the immutable rule of the Appalachians? Bite your lip until it bleeds, pull the covers tight, and pray for the dawn. Or will that damned heroic ego, the towering arrogance of a modern human, compel you to throw off the sheets and step out into that void to play the role of some foolish savior? Think very carefully before you answer, but do not ponder it for too long, because whatever is currently slithering across your ceiling in this exact moment is also intensely curious to know what you will choose. Head down to the comments section and tell me what you will do. I promise I will read every single line. And if you manage to survive this night and still harbor a morbid craving for more truths buried beneath rotting suits of human skin, leave a like and subscribe to the channel. Remember, when you hear your name called from a void devoid of light, absolutely do not answer. Until next time, sleep well.